His brain rebooted and installed a new language. The first sound Rory Curtis heard after the darkness wasn't his name. It wasn't the beeping of machines or the soft urgency of nurses moving around his bed. It was his own voice, unfamiliar, confident, and speaking a language he had never learned. At 9:12 a.m. in a hospital room in northern England, Rory opened his eyes after days in a medically induced coma and asked a stunned nurse, "Oh, Swiss G, where am I?" The nurse froze. She laughed at first, assuming it was a joke, a reflex, maybe delirium. But Rory kept speaking, full sentences spilling out smoothly, naturally, as if he'd been doing it his whole life. French. Fluent French. The kind you don't pick up accidentally, kind you have to live inside to know. Just a week earlier, Rory Curtis had been an ordinary man with an ordinary life. No background in linguistics, no childhood abroad, no hidden fascination with French cinema or late-night language apps. Friends would later say the most foreign thing about him was his taste in music. Then came the accident, a sudden, violent blow to the head that knocked him unconscious and sent his brain into crisis. Doctors rushed him into surgery as swelling threatened to shut everything down. To save his life, they put him under, pulling him out of the world completely, letting his mind drift somewhere no one else could follow. When he woke up, the world had changed, and so had he. At 9:14 a.m., his parents stood at the foot of the bed listening in disbelief as their son spoke to them like a stranger from another country. His accent wasn't perfect, but it was natural. His grammar wasn't rehearsed. It flowed. When they spoke to him in English, his response lagged, as if the words had to travel farther to reach him. French came faster, easier. The doctors exchanged looks. Neurologists were called in. Language specialists. Recorder was switched on. Rory answered every question in French, unless explicitly told not to. When asked if he understood English, he nodded, then replied again in French. By noon, the hospital corridor outside his room was buzzing. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't random syllables. This was structure, vocabulary, idioms. When a French-speaking doctor arrived and tested him, Rory passed effortlessly. Discussing daily routines, emotions, even abstract ideas. But when asked where he'd learned the language, Rory looked genuinely confused. He hadn't, he was sure of it. He'd never studied French, never lived abroad, never needed it. And yet it was there, fully formed, sitting in his mind like it had always belonged. As the hours passed, a darker realization settled in. Rory wasn't just speaking French, he was thinking in it. When asked to describe the accident, the memory came back fragmented, dreamlike, narrated in a language that wasn't his own. He struggled to translate himself back into English, as if part of his identity had been rerouted through a different system. Nurses noted changes in his personality, subtle but unmistakable. He was more reserved, more precise. His humor had shifted. Even his gestures felt unfamiliar to the people who knew him best. By 7:00 p.m., Rory tried to call a friend. The call didn't last long. The words wouldn't come. He grew frustrated, embarrassed, his voice tightening as English failed him in moments of stress. Later that night, alone in his room, he whispered to himself in French, grounding himself in the only version of language that felt stable. The brain, it seemed, had made a choice. Doctors eventually gave it a name, a rare neurological condition sometimes referred to as foreign language syndrome, not the accent-shifting party trick people joke about, but a profound rewiring where the brain prioritizes a language it shouldn't have. How Rory's mind accessed French at all remained unclear. Some theorized passive exposure, overheard conversations, television, fragments absorbed over a lifetime and stitched together after the trauma. Others believed the injury unlocked dormant neural pathways, bypassing the usual learning process entirely. No one could explain why French, specifically, had taken over. Days turned into weeks. Rory began rehabilitation, relearning English like a second language while French remained effortless. He described it as living in a translated version of his own life. Signs felt wrong. Conversations lagged. Jokes landed late. In French, everything snapped into focus. In English, there was static. Friends noticed he laughed differently, paused longer, thought more before speaking. It was as if the accident had Dan T just injured his brain. It had installed an update. At 2:30 a.m., one night, Rory woke from a nightmare drenched in sweat, heart racing, and called out for help in French. He later admitted that the fear felt stronger in that language, sharper, more real. Emotions, it turned out, followed the words that carried them. His memories began reorganizing themselves around the new default. Old experiences replayed internally with French narration layered over English events. His own past felt foreign. Months later, Rory stood outside the hospital for the first time. Air cold and bright, journalists waiting behind barriers. When asked what it felt like to wake up speaking a language he didn't know, he paused, searching for English, then gave up. He answered in French, calmly, explaining that it felt like waking up in someone else's house and realizing you knew where everything was. That nothing was technically wrong, but nothing was the same. Over time, some English returned, enough to function, enough to live. But French never left, stayed permanent and dominant, woven into his identity. Rory Curtis didn't lose his life in that coma. He lost the version of himself who spoke it the same way. Somewhere between the silence and the waking, his brain rebooted. And when it came back online, it brought something unexpected with it. Proof that the mind is not a closed system, that identity is fragile, and that sometimes survival comes with changes no one can prepare for. Rory walked out of the hospital alive. But the voice inside his head would never sound the same again.